The invitation had arrived 3 months earlier, printed on thick cardstock with gold embossing that screamed sophistication. Riverside High School class of 1999 to 25th reunion. I'd stared at it for a long time, my fingers tracing the elegant script, before tossing it onto my kitchen counter where it stayed for weeks, collecting coffee stains and serving as a daily reminder of everything I wasn't. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. At 38, I worked as a night shift dispatcher for the Cedar Falls Police Department. It wasn't glamorous work, taking emergency calls from panicked citizens, coordinating patrol units, filing reports that most people would never read. But it was steady employment, and in a town where the biggest employer had moved operations to Mexico 5 years ago, steady was a luxury. My apartment was a modest one-bedroom above Murphy's Deli on Main Street. The rent was cheap because the building was old and the walls were thin enough that I could hear Mrs. Patterson's television through the floor every night. The heating was unreliable. The water pressure was a joke. And the refrigerator had been making a concerning humming sound for the better part of 2 years. But it was mine, and I'd learned to find comfort in small victories. The Honda had been my only major purchase in the past decade. I had bought it used from a dealer in Waterloo after my previous car, a 1991 Ford Escort, had finally given up the ghost on Highway 20. The Honda had 180,000 miles on it when I signed the papers, and it now boasted nearly 240,000. The air conditioning had stopped working 3 summers ago, the radio only picked up AM stations, and the passenger seat had a spring that poked through the upholstery. But it ran, mostly, and it got me where I needed to go. I'd almost thrown the invitation away a dozen times. What was the point of subjecting myself to an evening of comparing accomplishments with people who'd clearly left me far behind? But something kept pulling me back to that piece of cardstock. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was masochism. Or maybe, deep down, I still harbored some foolish hope that the girl I'd been in high school, the one with dreams bigger than Cedar Falls, still existed somewhere inside me. High school had been a different world. I'd been Sarah Collins then, before I'd married Danny Mitchell in a ceremony at St. Mary's that had felt more like a consolation prize than a celebration. Danny and I had been together since junior year, and marriage had seemed like the natural next step after graduation. We'd both gotten jobs at the agricultural equipment plant, rented a small house on Elm Street, and settled into what we thought was adult life. The marriage had lasted 6 years. 6 years of growing apart, of realizing that shared history wasn't enough to build a future on, of watching our dreams get smaller and smaller until they disappeared entirely. The divorce had been amicable. We'd simply acknowledged that we'd become strangers living in the same house. Danny had moved to Des Moines for work, and I'd kept his name because changing it back seemed like more trouble than it was worth. But in high school, I'd been different. I'd been the girl who wrote for the school newspaper, who organized fundraisers for the local animal shelter, who'd gotten accepted to Northwestern University with a partial scholarship. I'd been the girl with plans, with ambition, with a future that stretched far beyond the borders of Cedar Falls. Northwestern had lasted 1 semester. The partial scholarship hadn't been enough to cover the costs, and my parents, who ran a small hardware store that barely stayed afloat, couldn't make up the difference. I'd come home for Christmas break and never went back, telling everyone it was because I'd decided college wasn't for me. The truth was more complicated and more painful than I'd ever admitted to anyone. The weeks leading up to the reunion had been torture. I'd checked Facebook obsessively, scrolling through the profiles of former classmates who'd tagged themselves in reunion-related posts. There was Jennifer Walsh, now Jennifer Walsh Carmichael, who'd become a successful real estate agent in Chicago. Her photos showed a woman in perfectly applied makeup, posing in front of luxury condos with captions about, quote, another successful closing. Michael Torres had become a doctor, specializing in pediatric cardiology at a hospital in Minneapolis. His profile was filled with photos of him receiving awards and speaking at medical conferences. Then there was Rebecca Stone, who'd been my closest friend until graduation pulled us in different directions. She'd become a corporate lawyer in Seattle, married to another lawyer, living in a house that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Her most recent post showed her family's vacation to Tuscany, all sun-drenched vineyards and ancient stone buildings that seemed to exist in a world far removed from the one I inhabited. Even the people who'd stayed in Cedar Falls had managed to build lives that gleamed with success. Tommy Brennan had taken over his father's construction company and expanded it into a regional operation. Lisa Rodriguez had opened a boutique fitness studio that had become the place where all the wealthy wives went to maintain their figures. They'd all found ways to transform their small-town roots into something that looked like achievement. And then there was me, Sarah Mitchell, night shift dispatcher, whose greatest accomplishment in the past year had been finally getting my landlord to fix the leaky faucet in my bathroom. The decision to attend had come suddenly, 3 days before the event. I'd been sitting in my car during my lunch break, eating a sandwich from the gas station and listening to the radio, when a news report came on about a woman who'd started a non-profit organization to help victims of domestic violence. The reporter mentioned that she'd grown up in a small town, that she'd started with nothing, that she'd built something meaningful from the ground up. Something about her story resonated with me, had reminded me of the girl I'd been at 17, full of fire and conviction. I'd realized that I'd been so focused on what I hadn't become, that I'd forgotten to appreciate what I had become. I wasn't wealthy or famous or particularly successful by conventional measures, but I'd survived. I'd built a life, modest as it was, and I'd done it entirely on my own terms. The reunion was being held at the Grand Prairie Country Club, a sprawling complex on the outskirts of town that had been built during the economic boom of the early 2000s. It was the kind of place that hosted wedding receptions for families who wanted to impress their relatives, complete with manicured golf courses and a dining room that overlooked an artificial lake. As I'd gotten dressed that evening, I'd stood in front of my bedroom mirror and taken inventory. The black dress I'd chosen was from a department store, bought on clearance 3 years ago for a funeral. It was simple, conservative, and showed its age in the way the fabric had faded slightly around the seams. My shoes were comfortable flats that I'd worn to work countless times, and my jewelry consisted of a simple silver chain that had been my grandmother's and a pair of earrings I'd bought at a craft fair. I'd done what I could with my appearance, but there was only so much that drugstore makeup and a $20 haircut could accomplish. My hair, which had been thick and lustrous in high school, had grown thin and brittle over the years. My face showed the lines of someone who'd worked too many night shifts and worried about too many bills. I looked like exactly what I was, a working-class woman in her late 30s who'd learned to find beauty in practicality. But as I'd looked at myself in that mirror, I'd made a decision. I was going to go to this reunion not to prove anything to anyone, but to prove something to myself. I was going to walk into that country club with my head held high, in my clearance dress and my practical shoes, and I was going to own every inch of who I'd become. The drive to the country club had been mercifully short, but it had given me time to rehearse the conversations I'd inevitably have to endure. The polite questions about my job, my living situation, my relationship status. The careful way people would phrase their inquiries, trying to gather information without seeming judgmental. The awkward pauses that would follow my answers, as people tried to think of something positive to say about a life that probably seemed impossibly small to them. I'd prepared myself for pity, for condescension, for the subtle ways that successful people communicated their superiority. What I hadn't prepared for was the feeling that washed over me as I turned into the country club's circular driveway and saw the collection of vehicles that represented everything I'd never achieved. The parking lot was a showcase of automotive success. Gleaming sedans sat next to spotless SUVs, their paint jobs reflecting the setting sun like mirrors. I could see a red Porsche that probably cost more than I'd made in the last 5 years, parked next to a black Range Rover that looked like it had never seen a day of actual work. Even the more modest vehicles, a Honda Accord here, a Toyota Camry there, were clearly newer models, their interiors visible through pristine windows that had never been cracked by age or accident. And to steuer herlitorrent. And then there was my car, my faithful, battered Honda Civic, with its faded paint and its rattling engine and its passenger door that required just the right combination of lifting and pulling to open properly. It looked like a refugee from a different era, a time when cars were bought for transportation rather than status, when keeping something running was more important than keeping it beautiful. I'd sat in that car for nearly 10 minutes, watching through the windshield as my former classmates mingled on the lawn. They moved with the easy confidence of people who'd never had to choose between paying the electric bill and buying groceries, who'd never had to explain to a mechanic that they needed the cheapest possible solution to a problem, who'd never had to decline social invitations because they couldn't afford the restaurant or the cover charge or the outfit that everyone else would be wearing. The courage I'd felt in my apartment mirror had begun to evaporate, replaced by a familiar feeling of inadequacy that I'd carried with me since the day I'd dropped out of Northwestern. These people had built lives that mattered, had accumulated the kind of success that commanded respect. And I was about to walk among them in a dress that had cost $30 and shoes that had been resold twice. But something had made me turn off the engine and reach for my purse. Maybe it was stubbornness. Or maybe it was the last flickering ember of the girl I'd been at 17. Whatever it was, it had been enough to get me out of that car and onto the walkway that led to the country club's entrance. The building itself was everything I'd expected, all stone and glass and carefully maintained landscaping that whispered of money and taste. The valet parking attendant, a young man in a crisp white shirt and black vest, had approached my car with the kind of professional smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Good evening, ma'am," he'd said, his voice carrying just the slightest hint of surprise as he took my vehicle. "Are you here for the Riverside High School reunion?" I nodded, fishing in my purse for my keys, trying to ignore the way his gaze lingered on the dent in my passenger door. "The keys sometimes stick in the ignition," I'd told him, handing over my keyring with its collection of practical tags, the grocery store discount card, the keychain flashlight I'd gotten free from an auto parts store, the small Swiss Army knife that had proven useful in a dozen different situations. "And the driver's side door handle is a little loose, so you have to pull it up before you turn it." He'd taken the keys with the same professional smile, but I'd seen the way his eyes had flicked toward the row of luxury vehicles behind me, as if he were calculating the tip he might expect from someone who drove a car that was older than he was. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. As I'd walked toward the entrance, I'd heard the unmistakable sound of my Honda's engine turning over, followed by the familiar rattle that meant the exhaust system was probably on its last legs. A few people had turned to look, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to barely concealed amusement. That's when I heard the first whisper. "Oh my God, is that Sarah Collins?" The voice had been just loud enough to carry, just quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. I'd turned to see a cluster of women standing near the entrance, their faces partially hidden behind wine glasses and carefully applied makeup. I'd recognized them immediately, the cheerleading squad, the popular girls, the ones who'd dated the football players and been crowned homecoming queens. "I can't believe she came," another voice had added, this one belonging to Melissa Patterson, who'd been head cheerleader and had married the star quarterback immediately after graduation. And in that car, I thought it was someone's grandmother dropping them off. The laughter that had followed had been like a physical blow, sharp and sudden and designed to cut. I'd felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment, my carefully constructed confidence crumbling like a house of cards in a strong wind. But I'd kept walking, my practical shoes clicking against the stone pathway, my chin raised in a defiance that I'd hoped looked more convincing than it felt. I'd come this far, and I wasn't going to let a handful of women who'd apparently never outgrown their high school cruelty drive me away. The country club's interior had been exactly what I'd expected. All dark wood and leather furniture, oil paintings of stern-looking men in suits, and the kind of thick carpeting that absorbed sound and made everything feel hushed and exclusive. The reunion had been set up in the main ballroom, a space that could have housed my entire apartment building with room to spare. Round tables covered in white linens had been arranged throughout the room, each one decorated with centerpieces that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. A bar had been set up along one wall, staffed by bartenders in matching uniforms who moved with the efficient grace of people who'd been hired specifically for their ability to make wealthy people feel pampered. But it was the people that had really driven home just how far I'd fallen behind. The men wore suits that fit like they'd been tailored specifically for their bodies, their hair styled in a way that suggested regular appointments at expensive salons. The women moved like models, their dresses flowing around them in ways that only happened when fabric was cut and sewn by skilled hands. And then there were the accessories, watches that caught the light and threw it back in brilliant flashes, handbags that I recognized from magazine advertisements, shoes that probably cost more than my monthly rent. These people hadn't just succeeded. They'd succeeded in ways that were visible from across a crowded room. I'd made my way to the registration table, where a woman I'd vaguely recognized from the student government had handed me a name tag with my high school yearbook photo printed on it. The image had been a cruel reminder of who I'd been, bright-eyed and full of hope, with clear skin and thick hair and the kind of smile that suggested the world was full of possibilities. "Sarah Collins!" the woman had exclaimed, her voice carrying the artificial enthusiasm of someone who'd been trained in customer service. "I mean, Sarah Mitchell now, right? How wonderful that you could make it." I nodded and smiled, trying to project the kind of confidence that I'd once felt naturally. But as I'd looked around the room, taking in the sea of success and prosperity that surrounded me, I'd realized that I was completely and utterly out of my league. The conversations around me had been filled with references to business deals and exotic vacations, stock options and private schools for children, wine collections and home renovations that involved contractors and architects. These people spoke a language of success that I'd never learned, moved in circles that I'd never entered, lived lives that seemed as foreign to me as if they'd been happening on another planet. And that's when I'd seen him, Daniel Walsh, who'd been my lab partner in chemistry class and had asked me to the junior prom. He'd been standing near the bar, surrounded by a group of men who were laughing at something he'd said, and he'd looked exactly like what he'd apparently become: successful, confident, and completely comfortable in his expensive clothes. When our eyes had met across the room, I'd seen the moment of recognition, followed by what looked like genuine surprise. He'd excused himself from his group and made his way over to where I was standing, his smile warm and familiar. "Sarah Collins," he'd said, his voice carrying the same gentle tone I'd remembered from high school. "I can't believe it's really you." We'd talked for a few minutes, catching up on the broad strokes of our lives. He'd told me about his job as a financial advisor, about his wife and his 2 kids, about the house they'd built in a subdivision that had been farmland when we were teenagers. I'd told him about my work at the police department, about my apartment above the deli, about the simple life I'd built for myself. He'd been kind, genuinely interested in what I'd been doing, and for a moment I'd felt like maybe this evening wouldn't be the disaster I'd feared. But then Jennifer Walsh Carmichael had appeared at his elbow, her smile bright and predatory. "Danny, there you are," she'd said, her voice carrying the kind of enthusiasm that never quite sounded genuine. "I've been looking everywhere for you." "Oh, hi, Sarah, I love your vintage look." The pause before vintage had been just long enough to make it clear that she'd been searching for a polite way to say outdated, and the smile that had accompanied it had been the kind that never reached the eyes. "Thanks," I'd said, my voice sounding smaller than I'd intended. "I like to keep things simple." "Oh, that's so refreshing," she'd replied, her tone suggesting that refreshing was not necessarily a compliment. "It's nice to see someone who's not caught up in all the material things." The conversation had continued for a few more minutes, but I'd felt myself shrinking with each exchange. These people were operating on a level that I'd never reached, speaking a language of success and achievement that I'd never learned. Every response I'd given had sounded inadequate. Every story I'd shared had paled in comparison to their tales of professional triumphs and personal accomplishments. Eventually, I'd excused myself and made my way to the ladies' room, where I'd stood in front of the mirror and tried to rebuild what was left of my confidence. The reflection that had stared back at me had been that of a woman who clearly didn't belong, whose best efforts had only succeeded in highlighting how far she'd fallen behind. The bathroom had been another reminder of the world I'd entered: marble countertops and gold fixtures, individual hand towels, and expensive soap that smelled like flowers I couldn't identify. Even the toilet paper had been softer than what I used at home. I'd been preparing to leave, to slip out quietly and drive home in my rattling Honda, when I'd heard voices from the main room that had stopped me cold. The voices were crystal clear through the thin bathroom door, and what I heard made my blood run cold. "Did you see that piece of junk Sarah drove up in?" The voice belonged to Marcus Klein, who'd been student body president and now apparently ran some kind of tech startup in Silicon Valley. I'm surprised it made it across town without breaking down. The valet kid looked like he was afraid to touch it, added another voice I recognized as belonging to Brian Hutchinson, who'd played varsity basketball and was now supposedly some hotshot investment banker. I bet he's never seen a car that old still running. But it was the next voice that really cut deep. Rebecca Stone, my former best friend, the one whose lawyer success in Seattle I'd been stalking on social media for months. I feel bad for her, honestly, Rebecca said, her voice carrying that particular tone of pity that somehow managed to sound both sympathetic and condescending. Remember how brilliant she was in high school? She was going to Northwestern, was going to be a journalist, was going to change the world. And now what did she tell people? A police dispatcher? In Cedar Falls, Marcus added with a chuckle, population, 12,000, really living the dream there. At least she came, said a female voice I couldn't immediately place. I heard from Jennifer that she almost didn't show up. Apparently she's been working nights for years, living in some apartment above a deli. Can you imagine? The conversation continued, but I'd stopped listening. My hands were gripping the marble countertop so tightly that my knuckles had gone white, and I could feel tears threatening to spill down my cheeks. This was exactly what I'd feared would happen, that I'd become the cautionary tale, the object lesson in dreams deferred and potential wasted. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to wash away the shame and humiliation that felt like they were radiating from my skin. The woman in the mirror looked fragile, defeated, like she was about to collapse under the weight of 25 years of accumulated disappointment. But then something shifted. Maybe it was the recognition that I'd survived worse than a few cruel comments from people whose opinions shouldn't matter. Maybe it was the realization that their pity said more about them than it did about me. Or maybe it was just the stubborn streak that had kept me going through the divorce, through the financial struggles, through all the nights when I'd wondered if I'd made the right choices. I straightened my shoulders, smoothed down my clearance dress, and walked out of that bathroom with my head held high. If they wanted to judge me, let them. I knew who I was, and I knew what I'd overcome to get here. The main ballroom had filled up while I'd been hiding in the bathroom. The cocktail hour was in full swing, and everywhere I looked, small groups of my former classmates were engaged in animated conversations about their successful lives. The sound of laughter and clinking glasses filled the air, creating a soundtrack of prosperity that felt deliberately exclusive. I made my way to the bar, figuring that if I was going to endure this evening, I might as well do it with a drink in my hand. The bartender, a young man with perfectly styled hair and the kind of smile that suggested he'd been hired as much for his looks as his bartending skills, greeted me with professional enthusiasm. "What can I get for you tonight?" he asked, his voice carrying the trained cheerfulness of someone who'd been instructed to make every guest feel special. "White wine," I said, then paused. "Actually, make it a vodka tonic, and make it strong." He nodded and went to work, his movements efficient and practiced. While he prepared my drink, I let my gaze wander around the room, taking in the tableau of success that surrounded me. Near the far wall, a group of women were examining each other's jewelry, their voices carrying excited commentary about designers and price points that might as well have been spoken in a foreign language. "Here you go," the bartender said, sliding my drink across the polished wood surface. "That'll be $12. $12 for a single drink." I thought about the grocery budget I'd carefully calculated that morning, about the $20 bill folded in my wallet that was supposed to cover my expenses for the weekend. But I handed over the money without comment, reminding myself that this was a special occasion, that I deserved to treat myself even if it meant eating ramen for the next few days. The vodka burned slightly as it went down, but it also provided a warmth that spread through my chest and helped ease the tension that had been building since I'd walked into the building. Armed with liquid courage, I decided to venture deeper into the crowd, to stop hiding in the corners and actually participate in the reunion I'd driven here to attend. My first stop was a group gathered around the memory board, where photos from our high school years had been arranged alongside more recent pictures that classmates had submitted. I found myself staring at a photo from our senior prom, where I appeared in a pale blue dress that my mother had sewn for me, standing next to Tommy Brennan, who'd been my date more out of friendship than romance. "God, we all look so young," said a voice beside me. I turned to see Amy Richardson, who'd been in my English class and had apparently become a physical therapist in Minneapolis. She looked good, healthy and confident, with the kind of understated style that suggested success without being ostentatious. "We were young," I replied, grateful for a conversation that seemed to carry actual warmth, 18 and convinced we had the whole world figured out. Amy laughed, a genuine sound that cut through the artificial atmosphere of the room. "I remember you were going to be the next Barbara Walters. You were so determined to get out of Cedar Falls and show everyone what you could do." The comment could have been cruel, a reminder of dreams unfulfilled and promises broken, but something in Amy's tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than judgment, and I found myself responding honestly. "Life had other plans," I said, taking another sip of my drink. "Sometimes the path you think you're on turns out to be leading somewhere completely different." "Tell me about it," Amy said, her voice carrying a note of understanding. "I was going to be a doctor, remember? Pre-med at Iowa State, the whole 9 yards. Then I took an anatomy class and realized I was more interested in how the body moves than how it breaks down. Physical therapy wasn't even on my radar until my junior year." We talked for a few more minutes, and I found myself relaxing for the first time since I'd arrived. Amy had managed to build a successful career, but she'd also maintained the kind of genuine warmth that had made her easy to talk to in high school. Her questions about my job seemed motivated by actual interest rather than morbid curiosity, and when she talked about her own life, she didn't make it sound like a competition. "I should go find my husband," she said eventually, glancing around the room. "He's here somewhere, probably cornered by someone wanting to talk about the good old days of football. But it was really good to see you, Sarah. I'm glad you came." As she walked away, I felt a small spark of hope. Maybe the evening wouldn't be a complete disaster after all. Maybe there were still people here who remembered the person I'd been rather than focusing on the person I'd become. That hope was short-lived. "Sarah Mitchell as I live and breathe." The voice boomed across the room, and I turned to see Gary Patterson approaching with the kind of theatrical enthusiasm that suggested he'd already had several drinks. Gary had been the class clown, the guy who'd always had a joke ready and never seemed to take anything seriously. Now he looked like a caricature of middle-aged success. Expensive suit, gold watch, and the kind of artificial tan that suggested regular visits to a salon. "Gary," I said, forcing a smile, "you look successful." "Can't complain," he replied, his voice carrying the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about money. "Real estate development. Started with a few rental properties in college, and now I've got developments in 3 states. Life's been good to me." He gestured toward my drink, which was already half empty. "Let me buy you another one. We've got some catching up to do." Before I could protest, he'd signaled the bartender and ordered another vodka tonic for me, and what looked like an expensive whiskey for himself. The drinks arrived quickly, and Gary raised his glass in a toast. "To the class of '99, he said, his voice loud enough to attract attention from nearby conversations. "To the dreams we had and the lives we built." I clinked my glass against his, but the toast felt hollow. Gary's dreams had clearly been realized in ways that mine had not, and his casual assumption that we were celebrating equivalent achievements made me feel even more isolated. "So tell me everything," he continued, his voice taking on the kind of forced enthusiasm that suggested he was already bored with the conversation. "What's Sarah Mitchell been up to for the past 25 years?" I gave him the abbreviated version: the job at the police department, the apartment above the deli, the simple life I'd built for myself. With each detail, I watched his expression change, saw the moment when genuine interest transformed into polite sympathy. "That's great," he said, his voice carrying the kind of careful tone that people use when they're trying not to sound condescending. "Really important work, public service. We need more people like you." The phrase "people like you" hung in the air between us, and I knew exactly what he meant. People who were willing to take the jobs that others wouldn't want, who were content with modest lives and limited ambitions, who served as examples of what happened when you didn't push hard enough or dream big enough. "And you?" I asked, trying to redirect the conversation away from my own perceived failures. "Tell me about real estate development." Gary's face lit up, and he launched into a detailed description of his various projects, shopping centers and office complexes, residential developments and commercial properties. His enthusiasm was genuine now, fueled by the opportunity to talk about his own success, and I found myself nodding along while my mind wandered. This was the pattern that had been repeating itself all evening. Every conversation began with polite interest, progressed through awkward comparisons, and ended with me feeling smaller and more insignificant than before. I was the cautionary tale, the reminder of what happened when potential went unrealized, when dreams were allowed to die quietly in small-town apartments and late-night dispatcher shifts. "But enough about me," Gary said, though his tone suggested he'd be happy to continue talking about himself indefinitely. "Are you seeing anyone? Married? Kids?" The questions felt like punches, each one a reminder of another area where my life had failed to measure up to expectations. Divorced. Childless. Living alone in a one-bedroom apartment with a refrigerator that hummed and heating that worked only when it felt like it. "I'm focusing on my career right now," I said, which was both true and completely misleading. I was focused on my job because it was the only thing I had to focus on, not because it was leading anywhere particularly exciting. "That's smart," Gary said, his voice carrying the kind of patronizing approval that suggested he thought I was making the best of a bad situation. "Sometimes it's better to wait for the right person than to settle for the wrong one." The conversation continued for a few more minutes, but I could feel my emotional reserves draining with each exchange. Gary meant well, I suppose, but his casual assumption that my life was somehow lacking made me feel defensive and small. When he finally excused himself to go find his wife, I was left standing alone with my second vodka tonic, wondering why I'd thought this evening would be anything other than an exercise in public humiliation. The dinner portion of the evening began shortly after that, with everyone finding their assigned seats at the round tables scattered throughout the ballroom. I'd been placed at a table with people I'd known peripherally in high school, not close friends, but familiar faces from classes and hallways. The conversation was polite and superficial, covering safe topics like changes in Cedar Falls and memories of teachers who'd made an impression. But even at a table of relative strangers, the pattern continued. Someone would ask about my job, I'd explain that I was a dispatcher, and then the conversation would shift to more interesting topics provided by people with more impressive careers. I became the person who asked questions about other people's lives, who made appreciative comments about their achievements, who served as an audience for their success stories. The meal itself was elegant, some kind of chicken dish with a sauce I couldn't identify, accompanied by vegetables that had been arranged more artfully than any food I'd ever prepared for myself. The wine was good, better than anything I'd ever bought, and I found myself drinking more than I'd intended, hoping that alcohol would dull the sharp edges of my humiliation. It was during dessert that things took a turn that I couldn't have anticipated. I'd excused myself to go to the bathroom again, partly because I needed to use the facilities, and partly because I needed a few minutes away from the table where I was clearly the least successful person seated. The vodka and wine had made me slightly unsteady, and I was taking my time navigating the hallway when I heard familiar voices coming from a small alcove near the entrance. It was Rebecca Stone again, this time talking to Jennifer Walsh Carmichael and two other women I recognized but couldn't immediately name. They were huddled together in the way that suggested they were sharing secrets, their voices low and conspiratorial. "I just feel so bad for her," Rebecca was saying, her tone carrying the kind of exaggerated sympathy that felt more like gossip than genuine concern. "She was so smart in high school, had so much potential. And now she's living like she's still 25, working nights and driving that ancient car." "Did you see her at the registration table?" Jennifer added. "She looked like she was about to cry. I don't think she realized how successful everyone else became." "Maybe she should have stayed home," said one of the other women. "Some people are better off not knowing what they missed out on." The comment hit me like a physical blow, and I felt the tears that I'd been fighting all evening finally begin to fall. They were right, of course. I should have stayed home, should have spent the evening in my apartment watching television and eating takeout, should have avoided this painful reminder of everything I'd failed to become. I was about to retreat back to the bathroom when I heard footsteps approaching from the main entrance. Heavy footsteps, the kind that suggested someone walking with purpose and authority. The women in the alcove seemed to hear them too, because their conversations stopped abruptly. "Excuse me," said a voice I didn't recognize, deep and commanding. "I'm looking for Sarah Mitchell. I was told she was here tonight." The silence that followed was deafening. Through the gap in the alcove, I could see a man in an expensive suit, tall and distinguished, with the kind of bearing that suggested he was accustomed to being obeyed. He was flanked by two other men, both wearing dark suits and the kind of serious expressions that suggested they were not there for social reasons. "I'm not sure where she is," Rebecca stammered, her voice suddenly small and uncertain. "She was here earlier, but—" "Find her," the man said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made it clear this was not a request. "Tell her that Director Harrison is here to see her." Director Harrison. The name didn't mean anything to me, but the way the women reacted suggested it meant something to them. They scattered like leaves in a strong wind, clearly eager to distance themselves from whatever was happening. I stood frozen in the hallway, my mind racing to process what I'd just heard. Someone was looking for me. Someone important enough to command immediate respect from the same women who'd been pitying me moments before. Someone who knew I was here, and had come specifically to find me. My first instinct was to run, to slip out the back exit and make my way to the parking lot, to get in my Honda and drive home as fast as the aging engine would carry me. But something kept me rooted to the spot, some combination of curiosity and the vodka-fueled courage that had gotten me through the evening so far. Instead, I took a deep breath, smoothed down my dress, and stepped out of the shadows where I'd been hiding. "I'm Sarah Mitchell," I said, my voice carrying more confidence than I felt. "I understand you're looking for me." The man turned toward me, and I saw his face clearly for the first time. He was probably in his 50s, with steel-gray hair and the kind of sharp intelligence in his eyes that suggested he didn't miss much. His suit was impeccably tailored, and everything about him radiated power and authority. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, extending his hand. "Director James Harrison, Central Intelligence Agency. I apologize for interrupting your evening, but I need to speak with you about a matter of national security." The words hit me like a thunderbolt. CIA, national security. This had to be some kind of mistake, some case of mistaken identity that would be cleared up as soon as I explained who I really was. "I think there's been some confusion," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "I'm just a police dispatcher. I don't know anything about national security." Director Harrison's expression didn't change, but I caught a glimpse of something that might have been amusement in his eyes. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "I need you to come with me. There are things we need to discuss that can't be said in public." The two men flanking him stepped forward slightly, not threatening but clearly prepared to ensure that I complied with the director's request. Around us, the reunion had come to a complete standstill. Every conversation had stopped, every eye was focused on our small group, and I could feel the weight of 200 people trying to process what they were witnessing. This was Sarah Mitchell, the failure, the cautionary tale, the woman who drove a beat-up Honda and lived above a deli. And the director of the CIA had just walked into her high school reunion to personally escort her away on a matter of national security. The transformation in the room was immediate and profound. The same people who'd been pitying me moments before were now staring with a mixture of awe and confusion. Rebecca Stone's mouth was hanging open, and Jennifer Walsh Carmichael looked like she was about to faint. "Of course," I heard myself saying, though my voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. "Should I? Do I need to get my purse?" "That won't be necessary," Director Harrison said. "Everything will be provided for you." As we walked toward the exit, I caught glimpses of faces I'd known since childhood, all wearing expressions of shocked bewilderment. Gary Patterson was standing by the bar, his expensive whiskey forgotten in his hand. Amy Richardson was at her table, leaning forward as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. But it was the women in the alcove who really captured my attention. Rebecca, Jennifer, and the others were clustered together, their earlier confidence completely shattered. They looked like they were witnessing something that didn't fit into any of their carefully constructed worldviews. The same Sarah Mitchell they'd been pitying, the woman whose life they'd been dissecting with casual cruelty, was being personally escorted out of the reunion by the director of the CIA. And none of them had the slightest idea why. As we reached the country club's entrance, I turned back for one last look at the room where I had spent the most humiliating evening of my adult life. The silence was complete now, broken only by the sound of our footsteps on the marble floor. Director Harrison held the door open for me, and as I stepped into the warm evening air, I realized that my life had just taken a turn that I couldn't have imagined in my wildest dreams. Whatever was about to happen, whatever secrets were about to be revealed, one thing was certain: I would never again be the same person who'd driven to this reunion in a beat-up Honda, expecting nothing more than an evening of polite humiliation. The valet, the same young man who'd looked at my car with barely concealed amusement, was standing at attention beside a black SUV with tinted windows. His earlier casual demeanor had been replaced by something that looked very much like respect, and when he saw me approaching Director Harrison, he actually straightened up and nodded. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a deference that hadn't been there when I'd handed him my keys, "your vehicle will be taken care of." I almost laughed. My rattling Honda Civic, the source of so much embarrassment just hours before, was now being treated like it mattered. Because suddenly, inexplicably, I mattered. As I climbed into the SUV, I caught one last glimpse of the reunion through the country club's windows. The silhouettes of my former classmates were still frozen in place, still trying to process what they'd just witnessed. The same people who'd spent the evening measuring my life and finding it wanting were now facing the uncomfortable realization that they'd been completely wrong about who I was and what I represented. And sitting in the back seat of a government vehicle, about to be briefed on matters of national security by the director of the CIA, I realized that sometimes the most extraordinary revelations come disguised as the most ordinary lives. The SUV's interior was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Leather seats that molded to my body, climate control that maintained perfect temperature without any input from me, and technology embedded in every surface that I couldn't begin to understand. The windows were so heavily tinted that the outside world looked like it was happening in black and white, and the silence was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat. Director Harrison sat across from me, his posture relaxed but alert. The two men who'd accompanied him had taken positions in the front seats, their eyes constantly scanning the road ahead and the mirrors for any sign of pursuit or surveillance. Everything about the situation screamed professional competence and serious purpose. "I imagine you have questions," Director Harrison said, his voice cutting through the silence that had stretched between us since leaving the country club. Questions. The word seemed laughably inadequate for the storm of confusion, fear, and curiosity that was raging in my mind. I had about 1,000 questions, starting with why the director of the CIA knew my name, and ending with whether I was about to disappear into some black site facility that didn't officially exist. A few, I managed, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. Starting with why you know who I am and why you interrupted my high school reunion to personally escort me away from it. He smiled, and for the first time since this surreal evening had begun, I saw something approaching warmth in his expression. It was the smile of someone who was about to reveal a secret that he'd been keeping for a very long time. "Sarah Mitchell," he said, settling back in his seat. Born Sarah Elizabeth Collins on March 15, 1981, in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Graduated valedictorian from Riverside High School, accepted to Northwestern University with a partial academic scholarship. Married Daniel James Mitchell on June 8, 2002, divorced April 20, 2008. Currently employed as a night shift dispatcher for the Cedar Falls Police Department. The recitation of my life's basic facts felt like listening to someone read my obituary, each milestone reduced to a simple statement that captured none of the complexity or pain that had shaped the actual experience. But what unsettled me most was the casual way he delivered information that should have required significant research to obtain. "That's all public record," I said, though my voice carried less confidence than the words suggested. "Anyone could find that information with enough time and effort." "You're absolutely right," he replied. "But what's not public record is why someone with your particular combination of intelligence, resilience, and moral character caught our attention 15 years ago. 15 years ago. I did the math quickly, realizing he was talking about 2010. Just 2 years after my divorce, when I was still trying to rebuild my life from the ground up. I'd been working at the police department for less than a year, living in a studio apartment that barely qualified as habitable, and spending most of my free time wondering where everything had gone wrong. Pal, I don't understand, I said, and for the first time in this conversation, my confusion was genuine rather than defensive. I was nobody 15 years ago. I am nobody now. I answer phones and dispatch patrol units. I live alone and drive a car that's held together with prayer and duct tape. Director Harrison leaned forward, his expression growing more serious. Sarah, what I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels of government. The information I'm sharing with you tonight has a security clearance that fewer than 50 people in the entire country are authorized to access. The weight of his words settled over me like a heavy blanket. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity or a bureaucratic mix-up. This was real, whatever it was, and I was apparently at the center of it. In 2010, he continued, we received intelligence about a planned terrorist attack targeting infrastructure in the Midwest. The details were vague, but we knew it involved someone with intimate knowledge of emergency response protocols in small cities and towns. I felt a chill run down my spine. Emergency response protocols. That was exactly the kind of information I dealt with every night at the police department. We began monitoring communication channels in potential target areas, looking for any unusual patterns or suspicious activities. What we found instead was something remarkable. In Cedar Falls, Iowa, there was a police dispatcher who was identifying potential security vulnerabilities and reporting them through proper channels with a frequency and accuracy that was statistically impossible. The SUV hit a bump in the road, and I realized we'd been driving for quite some time. Through the tinted windows, I could see that we'd left the familiar streets of Cedar Falls behind, and were now traveling through countryside that I didn't recognize. You were filing reports, Director Harrison continued, about weaknesses in the city's emergency response infrastructure that our own analysts hadn't identified. You were spotting patterns in crime data that suggested organized activity. You were making connections between seemingly unrelated incidents that revealed larger operational structures. My mind raced backward through years of night shifts, trying to remember the reports he was talking about. There had been dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Inconsistencies in security protocols, gaps in coverage areas, suspicious patterns of activity that had seemed significant enough to document but not extraordinary enough to think about twice. I was just doing my job, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I realized they weren't entirely true. I had been doing more than my job required. I'd been analyzing data, making connections, identifying problems that nobody had asked me to look for. No, Director Harrison said firmly. You were doing much more than your job. You were conducting intelligence analysis at a level that we typically see only from people with advanced degrees in criminal justice or national security studies. You were demonstrating analytical capabilities that suggested either exceptional natural talent or professional training that wasn't reflected in your official background. The implications of what he was saying began to sink in. For 15 years, while I'd been convinced that I was wasting my potential in a dead-end job, the CIA had been watching me, evaluating my work, and apparently concluding that I possessed skills that were valuable to national security. So you've been spying on me, I said, surprised by the anger that crept into my voice. For 15 years, you've been watching me, analyzing my life, and I never knew about it. We've been protecting you, he corrected. Sarah, the work you were doing, the patterns you were identifying, the reports you were filing, they were helping us track and ultimately prevent 3 separate terrorist plots. Your analysis provided crucial intelligence that saved hundreds, possibly thousands of lives. The words hit me like a physical blow. 3 terrorist plots. Hundreds of lives. I thought about all the nights I'd sat at my dispatcher console, filing reports that I'd assumed would disappear into bureaucratic filing systems and never be seen again. But why didn't you tell me? I asked. Why didn't someone contact me, recruit me, offer me a position where I could use these skills more effectively? Director Harrison's expression grew complicated, and for the first time since this conversation had begun, he seemed to be choosing his words carefully. Because your value to us was directly related to your position as a small-town police dispatcher. You had access to information streams that were considered too mundane for serious terrorist operations to worry about securing. You were the perfect, inadvertent intelligence asset, someone with exceptional analytical capabilities working in a role that nobody would think to monitor or compromise. The phrase inadvertent intelligence asset hung in the air between us. For 15 years, I'd been unknowingly working for the CIA, providing intelligence that had prevented terrorist attacks and saving lives without ever realizing what I was doing. The moment we officially recruited you, he continued, your effectiveness would have been compromised. Your access to information would have been restricted, your communications would have been monitored by hostile intelligence services, and your safety would have been perpetually at risk. I stared out the tinted window, watching unfamiliar landscape roll past while trying to process the complete recontextualization of my adult life. Every report I'd filed, every pattern I'd identified, every late-night analysis I'd conducted while thinking I was just being thorough, had been part of something larger than I'd ever imagined. So why tell me now, I asked. Why break cover tonight in front of 200 people from my high school, in the most public way possible? Director Harrison's expression grew grim. Because 3 days ago we intercepted communications indicating that hostile intelligence services have identified you as a high-value target. They don't know exactly what you do or how you do it, but they know that you're important to us. The SUV turned onto what appeared to be a private road, flanked by tall trees that blocked out most of the remaining daylight. Security cameras were visible at regular intervals, and I noticed that the 2 agents in the front seats had grown more alert. Important enough to kill me? I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. Important enough to extract information from you through whatever means necessary, he replied. And then yes, important enough to kill you. The casual way he delivered this information, that people were planning to torture and murder me for intelligence I didn't even know I possessed, was somehow more frightening than if he'd been dramatic about it. This was clearly a man who dealt with life and death situations so regularly that they'd become routine administrative matters. So what happens now? I asked. Do I disappear into witness protection? Do I get relocated to some small town in Montana with a new identity and a job at the local hardware store? That's one option, Director Harrison said. We could relocate you, provide you with a new identity, and ensure that you live out the rest of your life in safety and anonymity. You'd be comfortable, secure, and completely removed from the intelligence work that put you at risk in the first place. There was something in his tone that suggested this wasn't the option he was hoping I'd choose. What's the other option? I asked. He smiled, and this time the warmth in his expression was unmistakable. You come to work for us officially. We provide you with the training, resources, and support to use your analytical capabilities in ways that could make a significant difference in national security. You'd be based in Washington, with a salary and benefits package that would make your current financial concerns irrelevant. Washington. The idea seemed as foreign to me as moving to another planet. I'd lived my entire life in Iowa, had never been more than 300 miles from Cedar Falls, had built what little stability I possessed around the familiar rhythms of small-town life. But I don't have any formal training, I protested. I never went to college for criminal justice or intelligence analysis. I don't speak foreign languages or understand international politics. I'm just someone who's good at noticing patterns. Sarah, Director Harrison said, his voice carrying a note of gentle amusement, you've been conducting intelligence analysis for 15 years without formal training and producing results that rival our best professional analysts. What do you think you could accomplish with proper training and resources? The SUV was slowing down, and through the windshield I could see a complex of low buildings surrounded by high-security fences. Floodlights illuminated the perimeter, and I could make out multiple guard towers manned by figures carrying what appeared to be military-grade weapons. Where are we? I asked. A secure facility where we can continue this conversation without worrying about electronic surveillance or long-range photography, Director Harrison replied. You'll be safe here while you consider your options. As we passed through a series of security checkpoints, each one requiring verification from the agents in the front seat, I realized that my old life was already over. Even if I chose witness protection, even if I decided to disappear into anonymity rather than join the CIA officially, I could never go back to being Sarah Mitchell, small-town police dispatcher. The woman who'd driven to her high school reunion in a beat-up Honda, expecting nothing more than an evening of polite humiliation, no longer existed. In her place was someone whose amateur intelligence work had prevented terrorist attacks, whose analytical capabilities were valued by the highest levels of government, whose life was apparently important enough that enemy agents were planning to torture and kill her. The transformation was so complete, so sudden, that I felt like I was experiencing someone else's life. Just hours ago, I'd been the cautionary tale, the reminder of what happened when potential went unfulfilled. Now I was being recruited by the CIA and protected by the same government that I'd been unknowingly serving for 15 years. "There's something else you should know," Director Harrison said as the SUV came to a stop in front of a building that looked like it belonged on a military base. "The intelligence you've provided over the years, the analysis you've conducted, the patterns you've identified, they've led to the disruption of a major international terrorism network." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over me before continuing. "Tomorrow morning, coordinated raids in 7 countries will capture the remaining leadership of an organization that has been planning attacks on American soil for the past 3 years. The operation is codenamed Thunder Creek, and it exists because of intelligence that originated from reports filed by a night shift police dispatcher in Cedar Falls, Iowa." Thunder Creek. Even the name sounded like something from a movie, not something that had grown out of my routine observations about suspicious activity patterns and security vulnerabilities. "Sarah," Director Harrison continued, "in approximately 12 hours, the FBI, CIA, and intelligence agencies in 7 allied countries are going to simultaneously arrest 43 individuals who were planning to detonate explosive devices in shopping centers, sports stadiums, and public transportation hubs across the United States." The numbers were staggering: 43 arrests, 7 countries. Shopping centers and stadiums full of innocent people who would never know how close they'd come to being casualties in someone else's war. "Because of work that I did without knowing what I was doing," I said, the words sounding surreal even as I spoke them. "Because of work that you did brilliantly, consistently, and with a level of insight that we've rarely encountered in professional intelligence analysis," he corrected. "You saved lives, Sarah, thousands of them, and you did it while living a life that you believed represented failure and unfulfilled potential." As we stepped out of the SUV and walked toward the secure building, I thought about the reunion I'd left behind. My former classmates were probably still standing in that ballroom, trying to process what they'd witnessed. The same people who'd spent the evening measuring my life and finding it wanting were now faced with evidence that they'd been completely wrong about who I was and what I'd accomplished. Rebecca Stone, with her successful law practice in Seattle, had never saved a single life. Jennifer Walsh Carmichael, with her real estate empire in Chicago, had never prevented a terrorist attack. Gary Patterson, with his developments in 3 states, had never provided intelligence that led to international anti-terrorism operations. But Sarah Mitchell, failed journalist and small-town police dispatcher, had done all of those things. Not intentionally, not with any awareness of the broader impact of her work, but she'd done them nonetheless. The irony was almost overwhelming. While I'd been convinced that I was wasting my potential in a meaningless job, I'd actually been conducting some of the most important work of my life. While I'd been comparing myself unfavorably to classmates who'd achieved conventional success, I'd been achieving something that none of them could even comprehend. As Director Harrison led me through a series of secured doors and into a conference room that looked like something from a government thriller, I realized that my entire understanding of success, failure, and personal worth was about to be fundamentally restructured. The woman who'd driven to her reunion that evening no longer existed. In her place was someone whose work mattered, whose capabilities were valued, whose future was filled with possibilities that she'd never imagined. And somewhere back in Cedar Falls, in the ballroom of the Grand Prairie Country Club, 200 people who thought they knew Sarah Mitchell were discovering that they'd never known her at all. The conference room felt like something out of a political thriller: polished hardwood tables surrounded by ergonomic chairs, multiple screens embedded in the walls, and a secure communications setup that probably cost more than I'd earned in the past 5 years. Director Harrison gestured for me to take a seat while his agents positioned themselves near the door, their alertness suggesting that even here, in this fortress-like facility, security remained a primary concern. Before you make your decision, Director Harrison said, settling into the chair across from me, I want you to understand exactly what your intelligence work has accomplished. You deserve to know the full scope of what you've been part of. He activated one of the wall screens, and suddenly I was looking at a map of the United States dotted with red markers. Each marker, he explained, represented a location where terrorist attacks had been planned, and each plan had been disrupted using intelligence that originated from my routine reports from Cedar Falls. Chicago, 2012, he said, pointing to a marker near Lake Michigan, a plot to detonate explosives during the Cubs' home opener. Your analysis of communication patterns between suspected individuals in 3 different states provided the initial thread that led us to the cell. The screen shifted to show surveillance photos of men I'd never seen before, their faces serious and determined. Knowing that these people had planned to murder hundreds of baseball fans, and that something I'd observed during a quiet night shift had helped stop them, felt surreal. Minneapolis, 2015, Director Harrison continued, highlighting another marker. A coordinated attack on the Mall of America during Black Friday shopping. Your identification of unusual financial transactions moving through small Iowa banks led us to the funding source. More photos appeared, different faces, but the same cold determination. I thought about all the families who'd gone shopping that day, completely unaware that they'd been targets in someone's war against innocent people. Atlanta, 2018, he said. A planned bombing at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. Your report about suspicious vehicle rental patterns in rural Iowa provided crucial intelligence about the logistics network. The list continued. Denver, Seattle, Phoenix, each city representing thousands of lives that had been saved because I'd noticed something that seemed worth documenting. Each terrorist plot that had been prevented because I'd filed a report about patterns that struck me as unusual or concerning. But the operation we're launching tomorrow, Director Harrison said, his voice taking on added gravity, represents the culmination of 15 years of intelligence gathering. The network we're dismantling has been planning what they call the harvest, simultaneous attacks on soft targets across the country during peak holiday shopping periods. The screen now showed a complex organizational chart with dozens of photos connected by lines indicating communication patterns, financial relationships, and operational hierarchies. At the center was a man whose cold eyes seemed to stare directly at me through the screen. Rashid al-Mansouri, Director Harrison said, Syrian national, trained in Afghanistan, operational commander for a network that spans 4 continents. For 3 years, he's been building toward an attack that would have made September 11th look like a preliminary exercise. I stared at the photograph, trying to comprehend that this man, who looked like he could have been standing in line at any grocery store in America, had been planning mass murder on an unimaginable scale. The breakthrough came 18 months ago, Director Harrison continued, when you filed a report about unusual patterns in emergency service requests in 3 Iowa counties. The requests seemed random. False alarms, suspicious person reports, requests for escorts to locations that turned out to be empty. But your analysis suggested they might be reconnaissance activities. I remembered that report. It had been a slow week, and I'd noticed that emergency calls were coming in from locations that formed what looked like testing patterns, as if someone was trying to determine response times and protocols for different types of incidents. That report led us to a surveillance network that was mapping emergency response capabilities in small towns and rural areas across the Midwest. They weren't planning to attack major cities, Sarah. They were planning to attack places exactly like Cedar Falls. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. They hadn't been planning to attack New York or Los Angeles or Washington, D.C. They'd been planning to target small towns, places where people felt safe, where security was minimal, where first responders were volunteers rather than professionals. Places where people would never expect to become casualties in an international terrorist operation, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Exactly. Shopping centers in Iowa, high school football games in Nebraska, county fairs in Kansas. They wanted to demonstrate that nowhere in America was safe, that not even the most isolated communities were beyond their reach. The screen shifted again, showing aerial photographs of familiar locations. The Southridge Mall in Des Moines, where I'd gone school shopping as a child. The Iowa State Fair, where I'd eaten corn dogs and watched pig races. The downtown Christmas festival in Cedar Falls, where I'd taken photos with my parents every year until I'd grown too old to think it was fun. All of these locations were on their target list, Director Harrison said. 47 sites across 9 states, each one chosen because it represented the kind of American normalcy that they wanted to destroy. I thought about the families who would have been at those locations, the children who would have been excited about fair rides and Christmas lights, the teenagers who would have been hanging out at shopping centers and thinking about nothing more serious than which movie to see or which store to visit next. How many people would have died? I asked. Conservative estimates suggested at least 3,000 casualties, with potentially twice that number injured. But the psychological impact would have been incalculable. They wanted to make every American afraid to take their children to a county fair or a high school football game. The weight of it was overwhelming. 3,000 people, men, women, children who would have been going about their normal lives, pursuing the simple pleasures that make existence worthwhile. All of them saved because I'd noticed something odd about emergency call patterns and taken the time to write a report that I'd assumed no one would ever read. The coordinated raids begin in 4 hours, Director Harrison said, checking his watch. Teams in the United States, Canada, Mexico, France, Germany, Pakistan, and Syria will simultaneously arrest every known member of this network. By sunrise, an organization that has been planning mass murder for 3 years will cease to exist. He turned off the screen and leaned back in his chair, his expression serious but not without warmth. Sarah, I want you to understand something. The work you've been doing, the analysis you've been conducting, the intelligence you've been providing, it represents exactly the kind of capabilities that we need in the modern intelligence community. You've demonstrated an ability to identify significant patterns in seemingly routine data, to recognize threats that trained professionals might miss, and to maintain operational security without even knowing that operational security was necessary. The offer was implicit in his words, but I needed to hear it stated explicitly. You're asking me to join the CIA, I said. I am asking you to consider accepting a position as a senior intelligence analyst with the Central Intelligence Agency. Your starting salary would be $95,000 annually, with full government benefits, housing assistance for relocation to the Washington area, and access to training programs that would enhance your already considerable analytical capabilities. $95,000. The number was almost incomprehensible to someone who'd been living on $28,000 a year and considering it adequate as long as the bills got paid. It represented a complete transformation not just of my financial situation, but of my entire understanding of my own worth and capabilities. What would happen to my life in Cedar Falls, I asked. Sarah Mitchell, night shift police dispatcher, would simply disappear. We'd handle all the administrative details, resignation from your job, termination of your lease, sale or storage of your possessions. As far as your former life is concerned, you'd simply decide to move away and start over somewhere else. The thought of leaving Cedar Falls, of abandoning the only life I'd ever known, should have been terrifying. But as I sat in that secure conference room, looking at evidence of the extraordinary work I'd been doing without even realizing it, the prospect felt more like liberation than loss. And if I choose witness protection instead? You'd be relocated to a small city in the Pacific Northwest, population around 50,000, large enough for anonymity but small enough to feel manageable. New identity, new background, modest but comfortable financial support. You'd be safe, but you'd also be removed from any possibility of continuing the intelligence work that you've proven to be exceptionally good at. The choice was clear, but I found myself thinking about the people I'd be leaving behind. My landlord, Mr. Murphy, who'd been kind about late rent payments during the months when my car repairs had exceeded my budget. Mrs. Patterson upstairs, whose television I'd grown accustomed to hearing through the thin walls. My supervisor at the police department, who'd never questioned my tendency to file more reports than the job technically required. But then I thought about the alternatives. I could return to Cedar Falls and spend the rest of my life answering emergency calls and filing reports that I'd now know were being analyzed by intelligence professionals. I could continue living in my modest apartment, driving my aging Honda, and wondering if I'd made the right choice. Or I could embrace the possibility that the skills I'd developed through necessity and curiosity were actually valuable, that the work I'd been doing without recognition or reward was actually important, that the life I'd been building in the shadows was actually meaningful. "Director Harrison," I said, my voice steady and clear, "I accept your offer." He smiled, and for the first time since this extraordinary evening had begun, his expression was one of unqualified satisfaction. "Welcome to the Central Intelligence Agency, Senior Analyst Mitchell." The title felt strange and wonderful at the same time, Senior Analyst Mitchell. Not Sarah the failed journalist, not Sarah the small-town dispatcher, not Sarah the cautionary tale about unfulfilled potential. Senior Analyst Mitchell, whose work mattered, whose capabilities were valued, whose future was filled with possibilities she'd never imagined. "There's one more thing," Director Harrison said, reaching into his jacket and pulling out a small electronic device. "Your former classmates at the reunion tonight? They're probably still trying to process what they witnessed. By morning, the local news will be reporting that a Cedar Falls police dispatcher was recruited by the federal government for specialized intelligence work. The story will be vague on details, but it will confirm that you were exactly what you appeared to be tonight, someone whose capabilities were recognized and valued by the highest levels of government." I thought about Rebecca Stone and Jennifer Walsh Carmichael, about Gary Patterson and all the others who'd spent the evening measuring my life and finding it lacking. Tomorrow they'd wake up to discover that the woman they'd pitied had been conducting intelligence work that prevented terrorist attacks, that her mundane job had been cover for activities that saved thousands of lives. The irony was perfect. While they'd been building conventional success, law practices and real estate empires and business developments, I'd been engaged in work that actually mattered on a scale they could never comprehend. 6 months later, I was sitting in my office in Langley, Virginia, analyzing intelligence reports from field agents across 3 continents. My apartment was in a secure building 20 minutes from headquarters. My car was a reliable sedan that started every morning without requiring prayer or coaxing, and my bank account contained more money than I'd ever dreamed of having. But the most satisfying moment had come 3 weeks after Operation Thunder Creek, when I'd received a handwritten note from Director Harrison. It contained just 2 sentences. "The network has been completely dismantled. Every planned attack has been prevented." 47 locations across 9 states. Thousands of families who would never know how close they'd come to tragedy. Children who would grow up attending county fairs and Christmas festivals without ever knowing that someone had planned to turn their innocent pleasures into scenes of mass murder. All of it was prevented because a small-town police dispatcher had noticed patterns that seemed worth documenting. Sometimes I think about that reunion, about the moment when Director Harrison walked into the Grand Prairie Country Club and everything changed. I think about the expression on Rebecca's face when she realized that her successful law practice paled in comparison to work that actually saved lives. I think about Jennifer's shock when she discovered that someone she'd dismissed as a failure had been conducting intelligence operations that spanned multiple continents. But mostly I think about the lesson that night taught me about the nature of success and failure, about the difference between visible achievement and meaningful work, about the possibility that extraordinary purpose can be hidden within the most ordinary-seeming lives. The woman who drove to her high school reunion in a beat-up Honda, expecting nothing more than an evening of polite humiliation, discovered that she'd been living an extraordinary life all along. She just hadn't known it yet. And sometimes, that's the most powerful kind of success there is. The kind that saves lives without seeking recognition, that serves others without demanding acknowledgement, that makes the world safer simply because someone cared enough to notice patterns that others missed. My name is Sarah Mitchell, Senior Intelligence Analyst with the Central Intelligence Agency. And this is the story of how the most humiliating night of my life became the moment when I discovered who I really was. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.